It's a beautiful book, Swift to the Sky, obviously a labour of love. How long did it take you to put all this information together?
About a year to do that, but leaning on research that I've done over the previous 10 years or so on my books on New Zealanders who died in military aviation.
Now, when you think of something like the New Zealand Royal Air Force, you tend to think of planes and things that have gone on in the past. Your book brings it all to life, and I found whilst I was reading it quite emotional, because these are real people that have served for the best part of 100 years. How have you managed to bring these people alive in the book?
Through diaries that they've compiled, through letters they've written, reports that they've written, concentrating mainly on contemporary accounts because they're much more relevant, I feel, to what was happening then, as opposed to somebody telling you or writing about it 60 years after the event, which is coloured by what's happened since, and is perhaps compiled from what they think might be interesting now. And what's overlooked in that process is what people were doing day to day and how they felt at the time, without knowing what even the outcome of the war would be, or what their personal outcome would be.
Many of the men were very young when they went into the Air Force, predominantly men, and you do have to wonder if they knew what they were letting themselves in for.
I think there's a mixture there. I think people went for different reasons, because it was exciting, because they wanted to be with their mates, because they wanted to fly, because they knew they'd have to go anyway, because they could see that Hitler or the Nazi regime had to be defeated. There's no one all-encompassing reason why people go and do these things. With the 1930s and in the war time, New Zealand made a commitment to supply the RAF with pilots, whereas if that hadn't happened, because the New Zealand Air Force was so small, the chances of actually being in military aviation were very, very small. It was because of the threat of war in the 1930s, when the Nazis came to power, that the RAF began to expand and of course needed more manpower, and they drew on people from overseas, from the Dominions as well, and New Zealand was quite prominent in, given its size, population was only about 1.5 million at the time, in supplying those people.
It seems over the years New Zealanders have had more than their fair share of casualties.
A very high rate. It's quite different to being in the Army or the Navy. If you're in the Army and your truck breaks down, you just pull across the side of the road and wait for help or do something about it. But when you're flying, because the key thing is time, you're time limited. You've only got a certain amount of time from the time you take off to getting down again. So if something goes wrong, you're very limited in the amount of time you can do something about it, and you can't call on help. You've got to handle it yourself. And if you look at the figures in the books that I've written, a third of flying deaths in the war were actually through accidents rather than combat. And that's just a figure that's just so totally different to what happens in the Army or the Navy.
You talk about the prisoners of war. You realise that they were very young. How do you think they coped?
I think it grew up rather quickly when you're in that circumstance. When you go through the training, and that's all very exciting, but it takes time. It might take 18 months, 2 years to get from, say, when you went into camp here to when you get to an operational unit, say in Europe. Once you get there, of course, the reality hits home that it's a serious business.
When we go into the museum, there's one area that is dedicated to medals that Air Force personnel have received over the years, and you look at the cases with all these medals in, but I think what makes it come to life is the fact that there is the photograph of that person next to the medal. What does it mean when you can feel so much emotion just with basically what is a lump of metal in a photograph? Why do you think that brings so much emotion out of people?
Well, I guess because medals on their own, that's just what they are. They're just a piece of metal that's been shaped and named, and it's got a bit of ribbon on it. Doesn't mean anything on its own. If you put a photograph of a person in that, gives a human connection, and then the attention really goes to the person, not to the medals. And then people will ask, well, why or how is it that they come to be awarded those medals?
Many of the items that you've looked at in the book and also are now in the museum, people come here and also will read the book and see those items and say, I had one of those, or I flew in one of those aircraft. Again, it suddenly becomes alive. It's not just a picture on a book.
It's almost a touching experience. And I think also that, you know, for younger people who, you know, today think that, you know, we always had television, we always had cell phones and mobile phones, iPods and so on, and until they, you know, get drawn into the lives of these people, particularly of, you know, the pre-war and wartime period, then they begin to appreciate that, you know, a lot of things they have today just didn't exist in those days. Like travel, for instance, you know, we take for granted that we can hop on an aeroplane and go around the world almost at a drop of a hat. Yet in 1930s, of course, coming out of depression as well, the majority of people just couldn't afford to travel. And suddenly, with the opportunity, if you call it an opportunity, going to war, you know, free travel. There's another attraction for, particularly with the Air Force. You know, once they did most of them did their basic training in New Zealand, then they were on a ship to Canada or to the UK. This was their OE.
So what do you hope to achieve by putting all this information together in the book?
I think it's just I mean, given that it's only 230 odd pages, that's a lot. There's a lot of history to try and cram into that. So it's really a general history of New Zealand as a military aviation, but with heavy emphasis on the personal experience, rather than talking about technical stuff of aircraft and equipment and that sort of thing, which you can read about anywhere else in dozens of books or on the internet. But there's been, well, most of the material in that book, in that context, is original material that hasn't been published before, from letters or diaries, you know, contemporary information that hopefully tells people what it was really like at the time and how people thought about those things at the time.